For my audio presentation, I will be presenting on Jim Thorpe. His full name was James Francis Thorpe, and he was born on May 28, 1888, just south of Belmonte, Oklahoma, and Prague. And this was 12 years after the Battle of Little Bighorn. So, right after that time when the Indian Wars had somewhat concluded. And so at this point, Native Americans did not have citizenship in the U.S., they were considered wards. And this was that time when reservations were considered domestic dependent nations. So the U.S. did not recognize them as citizens during this time. So Jim Thorpe's Native American name is Watho Huck, which means bright path, and his mother actually gave this name to him while she was giving birth. She looked out of the window from their log cabin house and saw the sun rising down the path from their house, and so that's what she named him. And then he also had a twin brother that was born at the same time as him, of course, but his father was named Hiram P. Thorpe, and he was of Irish and Sac and Fox descent, and his mother was named Charlotte View, and she was of Potawatomi and Kickapoo descent. And his parents had a total of 11 children, and then 6 of them would die at around birth or early age, and then 5 of them would survive. So Jim and his siblings grew up on the Sac and Fox reservation. His father at the time was raising livestock and growing crops, so Jim took part in this as well. And while other members on the reservation, they were wearing traditional native clothing and they were speaking the Sac and Fox language, Jim's father specifically was adapting many customs of the white people, and he also wanted Jim to do this as well, and he wanted him to excel in many different things, and specifically to speak the English language. So as Jim grew up, he spent a lot of time with his twin brother, and they did everything together. They would fish, they would hunt, they would swim, they would wrestle, they would go horseback riding. And it became very evident at a young age that Jim had an athletic ability that was unlike any other. So at the age of 3, he successfully learned how to swim. So his father picked him up and took him out to the middle of a river with rushing water, and he put him down in it, and he walked away. And so Jim had to swim back to the shore. And so his father, he said, "Don't be afraid of the water, son, and it won't be afraid of you." So right from the get-go, when he was just 3 years old, there was kind of this mentality in Jim Thorpe's life of it's either sink or swim, quite literally. So at the age of 6, Jim and Charlie would be sent away to the Sac and Fox Reservation School. I think it was about 6 miles away from the reservation, and it was run by the federal government. And so Charlie was actually the more studious twin. He excelled better at the reservation school than Jim did. His grades were described as good, while Jim's grades were described as fair. However, Jim was outcompeting him in anything to do with athletics. So when they were 9 years old, an epidemic of pneumonia actually swept through the school, and Charlie came down with a bad case of it, and he would not recover from that. So he would die at the age of 9. Following this, Jim was severely devastated, and he lost interest in school as well as sports, and he would repeatedly run away from school. His father would take him to the reservation school, he'd get out, drop him off, and Jim would just run right back home. So his father could not figure out how to get Jim to go to school, and so he sent him to a variety of different schools, but the same outcome was the product of that. So when Jim was 16, he was recruited to go to Carlisle Indian School to learn a trade, which was bookkeeping. And so while he was there, he saw a group of guys out doing high jump. He was walking with a couple of friends carrying books, and he was very intrigued by this. So he handed his stack of books to a couple of his friends, and he walked over, and he ended up clearing 5 feet 8 inches on the high jump in street clothes. And so when he did this, the coach there, who was the famous Pop Warner, recognized that and wanted him to try out for the track team. So he got on the track team, and he excelled right away in that. And so he would also go on to play football, and he would be the featured halfback on the team, and he would lead the team to many victories over the next 2 years. He would receive third team All American status in 1908, playing for Carlisle, and this was the highest honor for a collegiate athlete at that time. So in the spring of 1909, Jim Thorpe was still starring in track, but he left Carlisle with two other students to go to North Carolina and played baseball as a semi-professional. And they played in Rocky Mount in East with the Eastern Carolina Association, and Jim was getting paid about $2 a game or $15 a week. So at this point, when Jim was playing baseball, it wasn't clear whether or not he was going to return to Carlisle Indian School, and so Pop Warner at the time was actually making a lot of money off of him and other Native Americans which he had recruited to play. And so he was betting on the games, and then whenever he would hear of a talented young Native American on the reservations, he would go and recruit them to Carlisle to play for his team. And then he actually built up a very strong program in football and track, and actually all their teams in sports were good at the beginning of the century. So Jim continued to play baseball, and then in 1911, Pop Warner convinced him to return to Carlisle and to play football again. So at this time, Thorpe was about 5'11" and 185 pounds. He was entering into the prime of his life, and he led Carlisle in 1911 and 1912 to defeat the best teams in the United States. He defeated Harvard, Georgetown University, and the University of Pittsburgh, and they actually only lost 2 games over that 2-year span. And so Jim Thorpe scored 25 touchdowns and 198 points, and for 2 years in a row he was named All-American. He would earn recognition as first team All-American halfback, and following this success in the spring of 1912, he rejoined the track team with the intent of trying out for the U.S. Olympic track team. And so when he tried out for the track team, the judges saw just a little bit of what he could do, and he was sent home. They didn't need to see any more demonstrations from him. And so he made the team right away with the intent of competing in the decathlon and the pentathlon. So he would go to Sweden, Stockholm, Sweden, in June of 1912. He was 24 years old at the time. And he absolutely had a stellar performance. He competed in the pentathlon, would win that, and then would go on the very next day and compete in the decathlon and win that. And actually in the decathlon, he took gold in the first 4 competitions. So after that, it was pretty much done. There was no chance for any of the other competitors to try and win. So after the Olympics, after he had won, King Gustav of Sweden addressed Thorpe as the greatest athlete in the world and presented him with several gifts. One of the most significant being Tsar Nicholas of Russia, kind of an artifact from his reign. It was a 30-pound silver Viking ship, and it had gold and precious jewels kind of all throughout it. And so Thorpe described this as one of the proudest moments of his life when he was awarded these medals in Sweden. So after this, he would return to New York City, and he was hailed as a hero. Many people looked up to him and lauded him during this time. And following this, his medals would be stripped of him because when he had played baseball in the East Carolina Association, it was considered professional. So his medals would be stripped of him for that rules violation. They would later be restored to him in 1982. So after he got back, he continued to play baseball, and then he moved on to play football in what would become the NFL. Ticket sales heavily increased after he transitioned into the NFL. He also became a coach and then would serve as the president of the association. So Thorpe would play his last professional game when he was age 41, and this was in 1929. During this time, the recession had heavily kicked in, and so he could not find employment, and he was doing all kinds of sorts of wacky jobs just to try and stay afloat. He was a security guard. He was a dance competition referee. He was digging ditches at one point. He was painting. And then eventually he would go on to Los Angeles to become an extra in many different films. And so while he was doing this, he found that the pay was unequal between the white actors and himself and other Native Americans. And so he ended up pushing for equal wages for the Native Americans and the whites. And he specifically noted that extras in the film, the Native Americans would receive $7.50 for a part, whereas the same role played by a white man, he would receive $15. So he noted this discrepancy, and he would have some success in gaining equality in wages. And the evidence of that is that his son had attested to it. And he would also go on to do public speaking, but to my knowledge, there is no actual video documentation of his speeches. But he traveled around the U.S. thousands and thousands of miles. He would speak in churches and auditoriums, and he would talk about his life and everything that went into it, being a Native American. And he did not earn a lot of money, but he enjoyed doing it. He also talked about Native American rights. He wanted to find a way to get revenues from the Sac and Fox reservations, which had been taken over for oil drilling. So he was pressing for those rights, and just continuing on this legacy after his sports career, which would go much further than that. And so when you think of Jim Thorpe, you don't necessarily think of an activist, but actually the latter part of his life was spent going around doing public speaking, and he actually joined a committee to abolish the Bureau of Indian Affairs. Now that group was unsuccessful in passing what was at the time called the Wheeler Bill, which would have turned over the affairs of the Native Americans back to themselves instead of the federal government. So one of his most famous quotes that he said, "I am no more proud of my career as an athlete than I am of the fact that I am a direct descendant of the noble warrior Chief Black Hawk." And so I think that that's a good way to kind of just wrap up the whole life of Jim Thorpe, because he was a warrior throughout. He competed in many sports competitions, but I think more than that, he also fought for his people and tried to push their cause forward. And I think he's still doing that today. There's a myriad of awards for him for the diligence and the perseverance that he put forth in his life.